The King of the West had many enemies to subdue before the White Tree could grow in peace. And wherever King Elisar went with war, King Eomer went with him. And beyond the Sea of Rune, and on the far fields of the south, the thunder of the cavalry of the Mark was heard, and the white horse upon green flew in many winds, until Eomer grew old. Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today I'm trying for a very different sort of video, but similar in style to both my what-if theories and my what happened videos, a sort of mixture of the two. We are going to look ahead in the lore of Middle-earth, use what we know of the Fourth Age and the Age of Men to come, and what we know of Tolkien's intention of making Middle-earth a bit of a fictional mythology for our own world, and a bit of what we know of our own world and qualities as people to guess and theorize what would come from Middle-earth after The Lord of the Rings. Now, I must offer this warning that since our own history in this world has been not as peaceful as it could have been, I must imagine that the Age of Men, one with less elven mysticism and legacies of the Elder Days, would have been similar in its tone to a lot of our own history. However, this is also Middle-earth we're talking about, an escapist place of fantasy and virtue, so we must also keep that in mind as we move forward. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today, and for trusting me to take a shot at this. Let's begin our tale. First and foremost, let's begin with the main political character of Middle-earth, going forward into the Fourth Age, King Elisar. There was a lot resting on his shoulders, and he knew it. Now I must imagine that Aragorn, versed in the histories and lore of his people, would see three things as priorities throughout the majority of his reign. 1. Rebuilding and restoring two formerly war-torn kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. 2. Stabilizing the peoples and societies of his reunited kingdom, and bringing them towards acceptance and peace towards one another, as well as the other people in or around their lands, other allies such as the Hobbits of the Shire, Dwarves of the North, and the Druidine. 3. Making war, and then peace, with any other threats to his people, as I speak mostly about the Easterlings and the Haradrim, but perhaps also the Dunlendings in southern Arnor, as well as any remaining brigands of Saruman who were still causing problems. Now, thinking as someone who has studied political science, I must imagine that even in a realm of men as fantastical and fictional as many of the people of Middle-earth are, Aragorn had an extremely brutal task in front of him. Putting the external threats to his kingdom aside, he had to rule over two sub-kingdoms of men within the reunited kingdom. Two kingdoms that only barely met each other geographically, with another kingdom, Rohan, in between them mostly, which would surely present a problem that we'll come back to, even though Aragorn had not ruled more than the Dunedain Rangers in his past experience. And now he had to get people to follow his laws, such as those that expanded and protected the Shire's borders, and those of the Druidine, and he had to get his people accustomed to an outsider, an elf maiden, for their queen in Arwen. And just generally speaking, Aragorn had to figure out how to be a king. These are political tasks that would be nearly insurmountable for any one politician in the real world, yet I think Aragorn could do it, because of his capacity to lead, his strength of will, his courage, and his kind-hearted compassion. Not only because of all of that, but because he would rule for 122 years, and he had a lot of time to get all of this done. So again, Aragorn would have his hands full with all of this. And again, the placement of Gondor and Arnor, two kingdoms where he had power, would certainly eventually lead to a lot of issues. Bringing in an earthly perspective into Middle-earth. Again, Middle-earth is meant to be a fantasy, but for the sake of this theory, we kind of have to. We see that two kingdoms, with such different lands, threats, cultures, well, we could argue that the cultures might be similar in these places, but still, different economies, outposts, and so forth between Arnor and Gondor would lead to a lot of challenges in terms of keeping it as one unified High Kingdom. At the end of the Second Age and in the beginning of the Third, until the death of Isildur, when the rule of Arnor and Gondor would be split between two cousins and their descendants, Arnor and Gondor were again far away, but connected widely through the land of Kalanarthon, a territory of Gondor, and southern Arnor. However, with Rohan's placement, the rule of Arnor and Gondor falling to one man would be made even more geographically difficult, since Gondor and Arnor would only be connected potentially on the western side of the White Mountains, as Rohan was almost itself an enclave country. which is a nation that is surrounded entirely by another nation, but again, not quite, since the reunited kingdom did not have control over the lands north of the Falls of Rauros. Now, I bring all of this up to say that, as we see in the early Third Age after the death of Isildur, it would be nearly impossible to keep Arnor and Gondor reunited under one king for multiple kings as the age went on. Therefore, I must say that, domestically, it is likely that the reunited kingdom would have problems at some point with this in the Age of Men, leading likely to history repeating itself and the ruling line of Aragorn's descendants being split apart once again, with one ruler taking the north in Arnor, and one taking the south in Gondor, becoming two distinct kingdoms, which is almost exactly what happened after the deaths of Anarion, Elendil, and finally Isildur. Now, with that said, let's turn our attention to what we definitely know Kings Elisar and Eomer would have to deal with in their own lifetimes, the other peoples of Middle-earth, and the kingdoms and tribes of men and so forth going on in other lands. I would imagine that for generations to come, hobbits and the Shire would generally be protected by men who knew and remembered the lore and stories of the Third Age, those who kept true to the edicts and traditions set forth by Elisar in his time. Likely they would be protected until, as we know, hobbits would eventually retreat and hide from the world of men. And I might imagine that the same thing could be said of the Druidine, hiding in and protecting their forests until perhaps men continue to expand into them. Dwarves would likely have a similar relationship with men, continuing to ally themselves and trade with the men of the West, especially those who lived closest to them in the glittering caves and so forth, or the dwarves of Erebor with the men of Dale, until dwarves began to disappear from the world, into their mines and homes and so forth, going to the fate that awaited them in the later ages of the world, diminishing as the elves would have done in the Fourth Age. The real question then becomes, how would Gondor, Arnor, Rohan, and Dale resolve their conflicts with the men of the south and east, and the tribes of Dunlendings and so forth? This is where my answer becomes more cynical, as I look more towards the history and state of our own world, and the nature of human beings within it, if Middle-earth was truly meant to be a mythological history of our own world, while still acting like a bit of escapism from it. I must imagine that there would be wars between the men of the West and the men of the East and South, just as the quote at the beginning of the video stated, and likely Dale would be a part of that conflict as well. But for a while, I actually think the West would surely achieve unmitigated victory after unmitigated victory, because especially Rohan and Gondor, Eomer and Elisar would be so united and strong together, whereas the men of the South, and especially those of the East, would be probably engulfed in many domestic conflicts of their own, likely fighting in civil wars and so forth with the sudden end of Sauron, who had once dominated them for many years. That sort of power vacuum would leave behind a huge political mess for the men that were once under the thumb of Sauron, because certainly some men would want to continue things the way they had been, and take power for themselves, acting as petty tyrants in the absence of Mordor's influence, while others would seek freedom and a new sense of self-rule, perhaps aligning themselves more with the ideals of the Free Peoples. This is also putting aside anything that might have come from Tolkien's unfinished sequel, In the New Shadow, both for Gondor, where the first chapter would have taken place, and anywhere else that story would have gone, but who knows, perhaps another Dark Lord, Black Númenórean or someone else, could have tried to continue Sauron's original goals and filled that power vacuum in some areas after the end of the Ring. This idea is explored heavily in the later part of the Lord of the Rings online main story, but I'm not sure. I think the world of men would likely see men as both the good guys and the bad guys. But focusing back on Gondor and Rohan, I must imagine that their wars in the world of men would have seen many victories, calls for mercy, and difficult decisions, making them victors over the East with new allies, new neutralities, and new enemies in the process. Yet, as we see in our own history, there are always conflicts in the world of men, and likely many of the larger conflicts would have ended and begun new ages of the world. Tolkien spoke about later ages, stating in some letters that perhaps we were now in the seventh age of the world. The internet has run with this idea, of course, debating how the ages of the world could have gone and lined up with Middle-earth, taking this fun idea of connecting Middle-earth's fictional history with our own and going along with it. Yet, I must imagine that Middle-earth would have seen many more evils in its later history, since men were the most brutal of the races among the Free Peoples. However, there would be goodness also. Even if Arnor and Gondor would almost surely eventually split into separate kingdoms again, I imagine that they would have continued to be allied in most all things, and Rohan would be as well, as each king would remember and be held to the oath of Eorl, renewed by Éomer, and the oath of Cirion, renewed by Elisar. And even as the magic and mysticism of the Elder Days faded away, the Valar would keep watch on the world of Middle-earth from far away in Valinor, and some relics, like the remaining Palantiri, Ring of Barahir, Anduril, and so forth, would also remain in the world of men for a long while. Eventually, at the end of things, if the Dagor-Dagorath idea would be kept intact in the lore, we can imagine that it would eventually happen, minimizing the later evils of the world as the greatest evils of Melkor and his servants would return, while the great heroes of the past would also come forth as well, to end one Middle-earth and set the stage for the next. And so, my friends, we come to the end of my thoughts on what would have happened after The Lord of the Rings. From this, we see the greatest parts and worst parts of our own humanity that would be reflected in the Age of Men. We see, perhaps, why Tolkien did not wish to truly create a sequel to The Lord of the Rings as well. But in this reflection, if we work towards it, we can work to maximize the greatness of humanity and minimize our own evils in the making of our own future history. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this different sort of video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on all of this? How would the later history of Middle-earth go? Let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles for our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch and Patreon. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Peter Shepard, Blair Scout and Merton, John Hume, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Arthur, Merlin, Dale Davis, Kingswald Project, Robert Bogue, Theodore, and Moon Viper. Thank you so much to all of our patrons and YouTube members. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. I'll see you all again next week with a video on why was Glorfindel so powerful. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.